This is the story of Capcom's D&D games, and honestly, damned if it isn't the most feel-good dev story I've ever had the pleasure of covering on this channel. Priority 1. Let's establish exactly what we're talking about with these games. Outside of Japan, we received these games only as arcade machines until somewhat recently. They were called Tower of Doom, which came out in 1994, and Shadow over Mystara, which was released in 96. While Japanese audiences got them as a home game via the Sega Saturn port in 1999, everyone else had to wait until 2013, when the games were sold as a package called Chronicles of Mystara. By the way, just to keep things easy, when I'm talking about both games together, I'm just going to call them Chronicles of Mystara, even when we're talking about back in the 90s when that wasn't a thing yet. You may have seen this game around and not actually known what it was all about. See, even back in the 90s, there was already kind of a weird push to hide how Japanese this game was. And that has continued into the modern day. Both then and now, to Western audiences, a more high fantasy version of the cover art was created, which is very much at odds with how the game actually looks. This was the golden era of 90s Capcom. So much of this game actually resembles kind of a crossbreeding between old school Dungeons & Dragons, Street Fighter, and a very surprising amount of anime. And there's a reason for that anime connection, because the story of the Mystara games is heavily entwined with the story of how D&D and other tabletop RPGs came to Japan. Much like how my wardrobe has become intertwined with today's sponsor, Into the AM. Into the AM is an unfairly good menswear company that creates just astonishingly high quality graphic tees, basics, and more. Really, they can't keep getting away with it. You know how when you first do laundry, you have your S-tier shirts that you wear first thing before anything else? Well, really, every single shirt I own from Into the AM has become one of my S-tier shirts. I love these things. It's become a problem. They can't keep getting away with it. We've got this set up so that if you use my product link, you'll get 10% off your next purchase. You can find it down in the description or in the pinned comment below. From right now until June 5th, they're giving away their entire collection of basics, such as this shirt I'm wearing right here, for 40% off. And yes, that's in addition to the 10% off you get from my code. Really, I can't emphasize enough just how comfortable these things are, how stylish I find the designs, and also just how many compliments I get in public when I wear these bad mama jammas. So really, you owe it to yourself to go take a look at what they have to offer on their website, because honestly, they've been getting away with it for far too long. Thanks once again to Into the AM, and let's get back to the video. D&D and other tabletop RPGs had a comparatively slow start in Japan. While the hobby spawned into North America in 1974 and was in full swing by the 80s, Japanese exposure was much more limited. A few Japanese college students studying abroad brought their D&D books home, and a few attempts had been made to publish Japanese tabletop systems. Likewise, D&D officially launched in Japan in 1985, but nothing really stuck yet. The real moment when the hobby began to kick off is a situation that may be familiar to people who are in the know with the state of modern D&D. Something that became popular in Japan in the 80s was something called a replay. You could think of it as a kind of proto-actual play. However, they're apparently still popular to this very day, so they're hardly an extinct precursor. For those who are unaware, an actual play is essentially a tabletop session that has been filmed and is submitted out to an audience to watch. The most popular and iconic of which is Critical Role, and you've probably at least heard the name. They've been dominating discussions around D&D for around a decade now, and they on their own are responsible for bringing probably tens of thousands of new fans into Dungeons & Dragons. They've got their own book series, comics, an Amazon TV show, and coming soon, they even have their own tabletop role-playing game, which is probably going to give D&D a pretty good run for its money just due to how popular Critical Role is. And here's the thing, all of this has happened once before in Japan in the 80s. Japanese tabletop replays weren't video works like modern actual plays. They were session transcripts and summaries that were usually distributed in gaming magazines. One of these replays, called Record of Lodos War, published in Comtique magazine between 86 to 88, was a Dungeons & Dragons replay that reached an absolute fever pitch of popularity. It was no time at all until they were practically forced to spin off into a series of novels, and eventually into a very pivotal anime in 1990. Record of Lodoss War already began to grow concerned about the worrying amount of influence that TSR, the company that owned D&D at the time, theoretically had over their brand. And eventually, in 1989, they chose to branch off and create their own TTRPG called Sword World. Now, a number of you may be wondering, because this situation actually mirrors modern D&D remarkably closely, did Sword World actually manage to give D&D a run for its money? Oh yeah, baby, yes it did. Sword World is still around to this day, and it is reportedly still much more popular than D&D in Japan. Thus kind of proving what we've always known. Tabletop franchises only make money and become popular off the strength of their spin-off media. Though, let's not get too distracted by how history went. Let's focus instead on the situation at the time. It's the 90s. Record of Lodoss War and Sword World had just brought TTRPGs roaring into Japan. D&D was on the market though, and it was still just associated enough with the phenomenon that they had some name recognition still. It was time for a big push to salvage the situation, a piece of explicitly D&D based media that would give Dungeons & Dragons a fighting chance. They chose to make an arcade game, and reached out to Capcom sometime in the early 90s to broker a deal. The rights were actually a bit tricky to negotiate, and although we will doubtlessly never know the details, one of the sticking points appears to be the fact that none of the Capcom devs knew very much about Dungeons & Dragons, nor did anyone working for Capcom USA, so TSR seemed like they were a bit flighty on the idea of handing over their IP based on that. The solution in this case is one of those you can't make this shit up kind of stories in history. Capcom USA found the first D&D fan they could find, and then hired him, and this motherfucker, Alex Jiminez, whose sole qualification was that he was some guy who liked D&D, went on to have an illustrious career with the company and with the gaming industry at large. It should have been me. Not him. It should have been me! All jokes aside, Alex had one main job, which was to make D&D palatable for a Japanese audience. How much influence he actually had is kind of open for interpretation. The interviews from Alex Jiminez make it sound as though he was a sort of auteur who invented this game, and the Japanese devs just kind of implemented what he told them to. However, if you hear the Japanese side of the story and the interviews from Japanese devs, they don't mention him at all. Now, it could very well be possible that they just didn't interact with him all that much due to the communication barrier, the language barrier. But whatever the case, it was Alex's duty to keep the game lore accurate, and to inject the soul of D&D into this thing. A task which he performed admirably. The deal with TSR was that this would be an arcade game, and it was soon decided that it would be a side-scrolling beat-em-up. Jiminez got to work on the story, creating a tabletop module about a Tower of Doom ruled over by Deimos the Lich. This was all set in Mystara, by the way, and as some of the only Mystara games around, you might think that we would need a quick lore recap to understand what's going on in these games. Or, if not, then great, they probably make a great introduction to the Mystara setting. Neither is really true, though. While Alex kinda worked himself up into a tizzy trying to keep Capcom lore accurate and make sure that the writing was a proper D&D tale, the truth of the matter is that this was an arcade game, and that all those narrative elements, while present, are just kinda blurry. At the end of the day, the story was go there and kill a lich, or in the second game it was go there and kill a dragon, and honestly that's all we needed to know. As to how good of a depiction of Mystara these two games are, well, here's an excerpt from an interview from Kenji Kataoka, the lead developer of the second game. Mystara is an actual place in AD&D? I think so, probably. Anyway, it's kind of hard to pronounce, isn't it? Point is, while Tower of Doom and Shadow over Mystara are lore accurate, they're hardly the definitive Mystara RPG experience you may be looking for. In fairness, the Japanese devs were kind of on the back foot here. The only Mystara lore which had been released and translated into Japanese was the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons version of Mystara. However, Capcom didn't have the rights to use the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons version of Mystara, they only had the rights to adapt the basic set Mystara. Which, great work whoever negotiated those rights, Jesus. But while Jiminez clearly put a lot of work into something that didn't end up mattering that much, he absolutely had a very positive effect on the design direction of this game. Both of these games were side-scrolling beat-em-ups, a genre that was kind of on its way out the door in the mid-90s. Shadow over Mystara, in fact, was the second last game in this genre that Capcom released. While poor timing meant that the sales were never going to be huge, it did have the positive effect of letting Jiminez scour a huge library of games for the right influences, citing Golden Axe and Thayer's Quest in particular as his big sources. He pushed to ensure that the Capcom games, like D&D itself, would have branching story paths and a very in-depth inventory system. And these two things together are a combo that makes both Mystara games fiendishly replayable. And it will take dozens of hours of exploration and trial and error to see all the content and hidden areas. One particular result of the inventory system and the spells was that this game was one of the most technically complex arcade games at the time. To accommodate this complexity and ensure that the games felt as deep as the tabletop versions, Alex had to argue pretty extensively with the Japanese devs that this needed to be a 4-button arcade game instead of the standard 2, which was more common in arcades. And here's where this story really begins to make me smile, because the story of the first game, Tower of Doom, is definitely the story of Alex Jiminez attempting to sort of inject D&D into a Japanese dev team who didn't know very much about it at the time. Naturally struggling against the fact that all of the devs really wanted to be making a Record of Lodoss wargame instead. The tale of the second game, Shadow over Mystara, is very different though. It's the story of a team of Japanese developers who are now fully on board with what D&D style fantasy is. They were a band of people who now fully got it, and together, based off of their newfound love for this IP, they were able to put together a game that was truly special. Jiminez described arguing with the Japanese devs to convince them to let Tower of Doom have 4 buttons. In an entirely separate interview, Kenji Kataoka remarked just how hard they worked to see if they could find a way to get the second game to use 6 buttons. The tone shift was dramatic, and I can't help but smile when I think about the journey this team went on. The second game was still a very Japanified version of D&D, but it was its own thing in the way that every D&D table is its own thing. The devs weren't trying to make a game that had any identity other than being unapologetically itself. I mean, look, the dev team made this little comic about their characters and passed it around their office. Isn't that sweet? I suppose this is as good a place as any to end the chapter on the game's development, and we can get on to the gameplay. Rest assured though, this isn't the last you'll hear about the devs in the video. We'll return to them soon enough. If I were to need to describe Chronicles of Mystara in a sentence, I'd simply call it a pair of short games that you can play forever. And that's only a little bit of an exaggeration. Being 4-button arcade games full of combos, items, and secret locations, Chronicles of Mystara leaves you with the feeling that there's always a new secret you can find, or a new skill you can master. The basics, however, are very simple. Attack, jump, choose item, use item. The complexity of gameplay isn't upfront. It doesn't get shoved in your face. You'll just stumble across it over time. Oh, I can attack while I jump. Whoa, somehow I raised my shield. How do I do that again? Eventually, you find reason to pause, and you stumble across the How to Play section, and you'll notice the combos. Oh, the combos. And you'll try these combos. And then you'll die. And then you'll do it again and again until eventually that glorious moment when it works. And then, minutes later, you'll die again. And you'll realize that learning how to trigger the special attacks is only step 1. It's the very first difficulty barrier. Even by the standards of 90s arcades, the Mystara games had a very high skill ceiling. I still wouldn't call them complicated, though. Technical, deliberate, difficult, yes, but never complicated. This is a game that will take months or weeks to play to really master, but you're never really feeling helpless or out of your depth at any given moment. This was honestly the first game I've played in a long time where I just felt overwhelmed by the sheer desire to become really good at it. And what's more, becoming good is warranted. This was an arcade game, after all. You will die a lot. This game was designed to guzzle your quarters. So if you wanted to play Tower of Doom or Shadow over Mystara, you either needed to pay the coin tax or master the game. And even then, once you've mastered the game, have you mastered it on every character? There's 4 to choose from in Game 1 and 6 in Game 2, each with different combos and skill sets, and what's this? Some of the story branches are harder than others, and there's an optional super boss in Game 1? The game was no doubt a coin guzzler, but on my own playtests, I realized I was kind of missing something of that original context. There are infinite lives in the modern version. The only punishment for dying constantly is a loss of bragging rights. And while I couldn't approximate the culture of old arcades in my playtest, I did try to accommodate the difference nonetheless. I did so by gathering together 2 of my friends, Indestructo Boy and Crow's Perch, to a stream on Crow's channel, in which we played through the second game, but took a shot each and every time we died.
After defeating the Archlich Demos and bring up, we never get to find out.
Oh my god, I just like stop timing. Oh my god, this is
Jesus!
amazing.
Yeah, it's like 5e spell slots. You just get like 30 of them. Oh, trap fire!
I figured out how to block. I learned how to block. If you have a shield, hit your attack button and then move backwards. Ah!
Yeah.
Oh, I'm dead!
Yes! He's dead.
I gotta take a drink, but also I gotta pick my guy again.
I'm not.
That's me.
Oh, did you guys both die?
Yeah.
Take those shots,
Okay.
bitches. Ma'am, please. Excuse me, ma'am.
Thank you very much. Now get the fuck out.
Yeah.
Listen, okay, I know she's riding around on a dragon trying to kill us, but I can fix her.
Oh my god, right? You'll never have her feet picks. Yeah.
The best one is for me.
Yeah.
We did it.
Oh!
We made it up. We're her Discord mods.
And now, yeah, we're in Discord mods. We just have him in a corner and we're just like kicking him and shit. All right, another shot. Don't give up, skeleton.
Keep posting through it, skeleton.
Post through it, skeleton. A beholder. Get fucked.
No, I got turned to stone. Our loss is chat's gain.
You know there's a skeleton inside of you right now.
Skeletons? You mean from Dungeons and Dragons?
Skeletons from Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, Crow, by the way, you're just not going to be playing this game right now because we're casting spells instead.
Yeah, I'm trying to.
You know, you hang tight.
I'm desperately trying to
We'll
fucking
let you know when we're
auto-attack
out of
this
spell
guy.
slot.
Let me hit him!
Zapping him. How much damage?
Yeah, I can tell. It's chewing through my fucking bottle of Jack Daniels.
I'm almost on the can now.
No! God damn it!
Fucking get good. That's your 13th.
God, 16 for me.
Oh man.
What a way to go!
Before there were gacha games, there were arcade games, and they
Yeah.
did exactly the same thing.
Wait, she's not a sexy lady! She's a dragon! That's even hotter! Oh, okay, alright, shots don't count for this. This is ridiculous.
No, shots count. Shots count.
Shut up! I can't! Yeah, you
You pay the quarter deck, the iron price.
yeah, you pay the iron price.
There was some like 12-year-old kid back in the 90s or whatever.
Oh,
I died again!
Fire?
fucking Koopa Troopa! Koopa Troopa to safety!
I owe at least like 5 shots.
It was a rather rough hangover the next day. However, I actually do recommend this as a fun way to play Mystara. I didn't learn much of anything about the difficulty that I didn't know before this experiment, but I did learn something valuable. Man, dude, this game is so much better with friends. It's fun solo, as you just kind of grind set your way through improving your skills, but nothing tops getting through this as a group. And that may seem obvious for a multiplayer arcade beat-em-up, especially one about a game as collaborative as Dungeons & Dragons. But do you know who that wasn't obvious to? Capcom. Kenji Kataoka remarked on the differences in arcade culture between Japan and the West, stating that, "With arcade games intended for a Japanese audience, usually you play alone at the arcade, and there's this unstated feeling of, please don't join in. But overseas, it's popular to play arcade games with others. For this sequel to Tower of Doom, we worked to strengthen that multiplayer aspect. We were surprised by the new or unanticipated ideas that came to us through that process." One of these interesting new ideas added into the second game was something that they had chosen to avoid in the first. The oft-cited wisdom of D&D at the time is that magic users should not wander off alone, because, they're squishy and they'll die. With the first game being so much more single-player focused, they thought it was a bad idea to include a magic user as a playable character. Instead, they dreamed up the elf, who is sort of a hybrid class and thus more capable in melee than your average wizard. Also, and I cannot stress this enough with the first game, they really wanted to be making a Record of Lodoss wargame instead. With the second game leaning so much more heavily onto the multiplayer angle, this time we got a pure magic user class, who is awful in a scrap, but can cast a mind-boggling number of spells.
I'd like to play, please!
No. We'll let you know when we're done playing, and then you can have a turn. While this is hardly a CRPG, the fun you can have with your friends is just the same as the tabletop version of D&D, as is the kind of homebrew spirit from the dev team. Alex Jiminez remarked that he knew they'd managed to retain the soul of D&D when he watched playtesters argue about loot. Now, there's an elephant in this room that we haven't talked about yet. It is, in fact, probably what brought a number of you to this video: the art style. This is, after all, the one and only time that an official D&D game was truly anime. I'm not going to hyperfixate on the first game for visuals. To some extent, it was designed by committee, with many different Japanese illustrators negotiating the visuals with the TSR company, and just also trying to sneak in as much Lodoss War as they could into it. The visuals were good, but they were also quite derivative. It's a miracle that this didn't end in a lawsuit. Where the visuals become more interesting as a subject is the second game, Shadow over Mystara. Where the first game was the work of two companies blending their ideal art styles together, the second was entirely the vision of an infamous Capcom illustrator with very little oversight. Kinu Nishimura was a relatively new illustrator for Capcom at the time. She went on to produce many of the more iconic works of Capcom art, and is sometimes thought of as one of the all-time legends of video game artwork. Mysteriously, Kinu Nishimura isn't her real name, and there doesn't appear to be any image of her actual face online. She's just kind of this elusive figure that cranks out iconic artwork. There were only a few games in this era where she actually got to be a character designer, however, and Shadow over Mystara was one of those times. Matter of fact, TSR appeared to mostly trust Capcom after the first game, and Nishimura remarked in an interview that they didn't really interfere with her work much. Based on the scattering of interviews and details around this game, I found only a few instructions that she must have been given. The big one was that TSR didn't like the magic user she designed. Initially, Nishimura had designed a very witchy kind of magic user, but since TSR rejected the witch elements, she chose to gender swap the character and make him a lovable edgelord instead, and then to make the Player 2 version of that character even more of an edgelord. I love him so much. However, still wanting to add a female character to the game, she also chose to gender swap the thief character they were adding. Costume pretty much unchanged. Noticeably, Nishimura actually reused the Player 2 male thief model in her work on Gaia Master 4 years later, and then also reused the released version of the female thief 20 years later in Code of Princess. Nishimura, you thought no one would notice, didn't you? But what you failed to account for is that some of us have a YouTube channel and no social life to speak of. In all seriousness, though, Nishimura was also given the power to design the villains and the two-player versions of the original characters. All of these elements, in my opinion, are just universally better than in the first game. Nishimura would list Shadow over Mystara as some of her favorite work, since she loved fantasy so deeply. And I think the results of that passion speak for themselves. The unique art style, packaged up with a high skill ceiling and great multiplayer, is basically the triple threat that makes Chronicles of Mystara the cult classic that it's always been. I'll link Nishimura's Mystara artwork and other stuff down in the description, so feel free to rummage through and admire. I would hope that everyone remembers this game for its lasting community, rather than failing at its original goal, because Chronicles of Mystara did not bring D&D to Japan. It never really caught on there the way it did elsewhere in the world, with local systems and Call of Cthulhu tending to beat out anything that came from TSR or Wizards of the Coast. Nevertheless, the games were a modest success, topping arcade charts in both North America and Japan for a short time after their release. Side-scrolling beat-em-ups were on their way out though, and if the franchise was to continue, then Capcom was likely going to need to rework the series on the scale of what Super Mario 64 did to the Mario franchise. Being that the games were only modestly successful, the rights were tricky to negotiate, and that frankly Capcom just had other more profitable IPs to focus on, I think it's pretty understandable why they never made another. Although I'm internally screaming that in '96 an awful Ravenlaw fighting game was made, I covered it last year, and literally Capcom at the same time had a D&D license. We could have had a really good Capcom D&D fighting game. Why did we get Iron and Blood instead? Why? Chronicles of Mystara had a lot of heart, and the devs on both sides of the ocean were clearly incredibly passionate. One story Alex Jiminez tells sticks out, of an extremely excited Japanese design team practically begging TSR to let the boat in the second game be a steamship, purely because that would be so cool. That's the kind of energy I like to see from game devs. It sets teams apart from the rabble when they're driven by pure excitement about what they're making. It goes down as one of my favorite D&D games that I've covered on this channel. Not merely because it's a fun game, and it absolutely is a fun game, but it also pretty much has the most feel-good story of game deving I've ever had the pleasure of covering. As a point of cultural contact, Chronicles of Mystara is a fascinating case where we saw D&D filtered through Japanese geek culture. It's not the only time that has happened. There are a number of anime that explicitly cover D&D style fantasy, but this was the only time a Japanese company got their hands on the actual D&D IP. And my god, they knocked it out of the park. I'd love to see Wizards of the Coast try this again in the modern day. Even if it's not Capcom or Chronicles of Mystara, it would be neat to see what would happen if WotC gave the license to another Japanese company. Unfortunately, in the modern day, D&D has kind of been on the retreat from video games for a while now, and WotC has no appetite for making the weird games of the distant past. But Chronicles of Mystara hasn't gone anywhere. It's reasonably cheap on Steam, it holds up, and you can usually get some pretty nutty deals on it during Steam sales, often in a 4-pack, so I highly recommend picking it up if you've got some friends to play it with. Honestly, it's kind of the perfect game to play with your D&D group if a session gets cancelled. Thanks everyone, and speaking of multiplayer games, we as a community just started playing the D&D MMO Neverwinter Online. Matter of fact, we just started yesterday. Down in the description below, you're going to find my Discord server for the event, so click that link and we hope to see you in game soon.